What does a man say to his wife before he flees in the middle of the night? Nothing. He says absolutely nothing. He waits until she's working late, then quietly packs his suitcase, grabs his passport, switches off his phone, and disappears into the darkness 10,000 miles away. And what does she do? 3 days later, she calmly picks up the phone to call her assistant and says, "Last night, I wronged my husband. Please tell him to come home tonight." And then she hears her assistant stammer back, "Ms. Wen, Mr. He has already packed up and left the country. Didn't you notice?" That was the moment Vivian Wen realized she'd known all along. Vivian sat behind her desk, absently turning a jade ring between her fingers. Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the pale band of skin on her ring finger where her wedding band used to sit. The mark was more visible than the jade itself, like skin that remembered something that had already left. "Jasmine." The young assistant at the door looked up. "Yes, Ms. Wen." "Last night, I wronged my husband," Vivian said, her voice flat, as if commenting on the weather. "Please let him know he should come home tonight." Jasmine's face went pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her fingers tightening around the edge of her folder. In those few seconds of silence, Vivian could see her fingertips trembling. "Ms. Wen." Jasmine's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Mr. He has already, last night, he packed his bags and left the country. Didn't you notice?" Vivian's fingers stopped moving. The jade ring glowed a deep green in the morning light. She stared at it for a long moment, then slowly lifted her head. The sunlight fell directly across her face. She was 35, well-maintained, with the kind of controlled sharpness that came from years of navigating boardrooms. Her eyes gave nothing away. "Left the country," she repeated the words without inflection. "Where to?" I'm not sure. Mister. He said he needed some time alone. His phone is switched off." Vivian leaned back slowly in her chair. She spun the ring on her finger. That thin, pale band of missing tan caught the light again, like an old scar smoothed over by time. "Understood," she said. "You can go now." Jasmine retreated as if pardoned. The moment the door closed, Vivian heard her footsteps hurrying down the hallway, like she was running away. The office fell quiet, the low hum of the air conditioning, the soft ticking of the desk clock. Vivian sat in her expensive ergonomic chair, gaze fixed on the grey-blue city skyline beyond the window, her fingers still absently working the jade ring. Derek was gone. She'd known. She'd known for 3 days. That night, she'd worked until 11. When she got home, the villa was pitch black. She assumed Derek was out entertaining clients. She showered, and before lying down, she did her usual glance into his closet. 2 suits were missing from the custom rack. A few cashmere sweaters were gone from the drawers. His passport case was empty. She stood in the doorway of the closet and counted to 3. Then she turned off the light and went back to bed. No questions, no phone calls, no hysterics. She'd spent 3 days in silence to confirm what she already knew, and this morning she'd used that line, "Tell him to come home," as a test, to see how much Jasmine knew, to see how far this play had gone, to see exactly how many secrets the man she'd shared a bed with for 7 years had been hiding. The test results were in. She spun the jade ring again. Derek had given it to her last anniversary, a high-grade piece of jadeite worth at least 6 figures. He'd knelt before her and said, "Vivian, you've had to put up with so much all these years." She'd smiled, put the ring on, and said nothing. She'd never asked him where the money came from. Vivian pulled her focus back and pressed the intercom. "Jasmine, Pull up Derek's entire travel history for the last 3 years, domestic and international. Put it on my desk by the end of the day. Jasmine's nervous confirmation came through the speaker. Vivian hung up and walked to the window. From 38 floors up, the people and cars below were tiny moving specks, each carrying stories no one else could see. 7 years ago, when she'd married Derek, everyone had called it a perfect match. The Wen family had deep roots in local trade and real estate. Derek had recently returned from overseas with a prestigious degree, spent a few years in investment banking, then launched his own fund. Their wedding had been grand. Half the city's elite had attended. But no one knew that the Wen family's business was already showing cracks. Her father's strategic mistakes had left them bleeding on 2 major projects. The cash flow was stretched as tight as a violin string. Derek had seen the opening, or more precisely, he'd seen the prime piece of land the Wen family owned in the new city centre. By the 3rd year of marriage, the land had been folded into a joint development project led by Derek. A year after that, Mr. Wen formally handed control of the company over to his son-in-law and stepped back. Vivian had just given birth to Siti. She was still on maternity leave when she woke up to find the world had shifted. She hadn't said no. She'd never said yes, either. She'd simply finished her postpartum recovery, left the baby with the nanny and her in-laws, and returned to the company. She sat behind the desk across from Derek's, and over 2 years, she'd quietly, methodically, eased him out of that chair. 2 years. All that time, Derek probably thought he was still in control. Vivian was cool, quiet, never argued in public, never checked his phone or followed his movements like other wives did. He thought she knew nothing. She knew everything. She knew about the woman on the side. She knew about every asset he'd siphoned from the Wen family's resources. She knew about the quiet, tacit deals he'd made with her father. She just never said a word. Silence was the sharpest weapon in her arsenal. She'd kept it hidden until its blade was pressed against his throat. A knock at the door broke her train of thought. "Come in." The door opened, and old Joe walked in. He was in his 50s, hair mostly grey, had worked for the Wen family for over 2 decades. His face carried the careful reserve of the old guard. He placed a brown paper file on her desk with a soft push. "Ms. Wen, the documents you requested." Vivian opened the file and pulled out a few thin sheets. Her eyes scanned them, paused briefly at one number, then she put the papers back and sealed the file. "Does my father know?" "Mr. Wen has been unwell lately," old Joe said carefully. "The doctors advised rest. I haven't told him yet." "Don't tell him yet." Vivian tucked the file into her drawer. "I'll handle it when the time comes." Old Joe nodded, turned to leave, then stopped at the door. He looked back at her. Vivian was looking down at something, the sunlight falling across half her face, illuminating a fine line at the corner of her eye. Old Joe had watched Vivian grow up over all these years. In that moment, he saw something in her he didn't quite recognize. A stillness so deep it felt like winter water, frozen on the surface, with no way to see what lay beneath. "Ms. Wen," he said, "regarding Mr. He's not in the country anymore." Old Joe paused for a beat, then nodded, said nothing, and left. When the door closed, the silence returned. Vivian leaned back, eyes shut, listening to the air conditioning and her own steady breathing. The jade ring turned cold against her skin. She opened her eyes and pulled out her phone. At the very bottom of her contacts was a name she'd never saved, just a single letter, D. She opened the chat. The last message was from 3 days ago. She'd asked, "What time are you coming home tonight?" He'd never replied. She closed the chat, set the phone down, and pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside was a small black velvet box. She opened it, a plain platinum wedding band, engraved inside with 2 letters, VD. Her wedding ring. She'd put it on 7 years ago. She'd taken it off 3 months ago, while Derek was away on business. She'd sat alone in the bedroom, slipped it off, and placed it in this box. The pale band of missing tan had never faded, as if her skin was more sentimental than her heart. She closed the box and locked it back in the drawer. The desk phone rang. The receptionist's voice came through. "Ms. Wen, there's a Mr. Su here to see you. He said he has a 10 o'clock appointment." Vivian glanced at the clock. 9:58. "Send him up." 2 minutes later, the door opened and a man walked in. He was in his late 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, not conventionally handsome, but with an agreeable steadiness about him. His eyes were dark and deep, and when he looked at you, he didn't flinch. "Ms. Wen." He extended his hand. "Ethan Su." Vivian rose and shook his hand. His palm was dry and warm, his grip measured. "Mr. Su, pleasure to meet you. Please, sit." Ethan settled across from her and pulled a document from his briefcase. "Everything you requested, equity transfers, property deeds, offshore asset tracking, and," he paused, "a full analysis of Mr. He's offshore company structures." Vivian opened the file and flipped through it page by page. Her expression barely shifted, except for a slight pause when she reached a section containing a photograph. A woman's face, young, beautiful, smiling. "This woman," she said. "What's her relationship with Derek?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "They've been cohabiting for at least 18 months, Mr. He spent most of his time in the country at her residence. She owns a property purchased with his funds and a small business that was seeded from his accounts as well." Vivian closed the file. What does all of this mean for Derek? At minimum, in divorce proceedings, you could claim asset transfer and fault-based damages. More significantly, several of his related party transactions using Wen Group resources involve what could be considered illegal transfers of benefits. The amounts are substantial. How substantial? Enough to put him away for several years. Vivian said nothing. Sunlight cast her shadow diagonally across the floor. Her fingers rested on the file cover, tapping twice, then stopping. "Mr. Su," she said, "I'm not moving on these materials just yet. I want to confirm one thing first." "What's that?" "Why he ran." Ethan studied her. His gaze held assessment, but also something like respect between colleagues. He'd seen many clients in the aftermath of marriage breakdowns, furious, shattered, pretending indifference. Vivian was different. There was a restraint in her that bordered on cold, and it told him she'd known the ending long before it arrived, and had prepared every step for it. "Ms. Wen," he said carefully, "if you like, I can send a formal letter to Mr. Yi. He—" "Don't," Vivian cut him off. "Let him go. I want to see how far he runs." Ethan asked no more questions. He gathered his documents, stood, and offered his hand again. Vivian rose as well. This time, his grip held a moment longer, warmer than before. "Keep me posted on any developments," he said. "I will." At the door, he looked back. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Wen." Vivian nodded and watched him leave. She heard his footsteps recede down the marble hallway, one by one, until the elevator swallowed them. She sat back down and opened the file again. The first page read, Derek He, male, 38, married, 1 daughter. Current position, Vice President, Wen Group. Domestic assets, offshore assets, pending verification. She read every word, then put the papers away and picked up the phone. Jasmine, reschedule this afternoon's meetings. I'm leaving the office. She paused before hanging up. Have you tracked down Derek's flight information? Jasmine's voice was strained. Yes, Ms. Wen. Mr. He flew to Tokyo yesterday at 3 p.m., then transferred to Zurich. Zurich. Vivian repeated the name to herself, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something she'd already known. She grabbed her coat and bag and walked out. Employees in the hallway greeted her as she passed. She acknowledged each one without breaking stride. The elevator took her to the parking garage. She got in her car and started the engine. She didn't go home. She drove to an unremarkable old neighborhood in the south part of the city, parked on the street, walked upstairs, and unlocked a door. Inside was a modest two-bedroom apartment, simple furnishings, clean, a few pots of pothos on the balcony trailing green vines that swayed gently in the wind. Vivian, changed into slippers, went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She leaned against the counter and drank it slowly, then set the glass in the sink and walked to the bedroom. From the nightstand, she pulled out an old metal box. Inside were photographs and handwritten notes. She'd studied these images many times. Derek and the other woman at restaurants, shopping, checking into hotels. In one photo, a ring could be seen on the woman's finger, identical in style to Vivian's jade ring, just a different color. Vivian's finger traced across the photo and paused at that ring. Then she put everything back, closed the box, and returned it to the nightstand. She walked to the balcony and leaned against the railing, looking down at the old street lined with plane trees. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering dappled shadows across the pavement. A few elderly men played chess in the shade. Children chased a ball. She remembered something from 7 years ago, before she and Derek were married. They'd walked this street once. He'd held her hand and pointed at a plane tree, saying, "We should buy a place near here someday. Take walks along this street when we're old." She'd smiled and let him keep walking. She'd been 27 then. She thought all her cards were good ones. Vivian stood on the balcony until the light began to fade and the shadows stretched long. Then she went back inside, grabbed her keys, locked up, and headed downstairs. She drove to Sichi's private elementary school. It was too early for pickup, so she parked at the curb, rolled down the window, and listened to the muffled sounds of children playing from behind the wall. Her phone buzzed. Jasmine confirmed that all afternoon meetings were cancelled and attached a screenshot of Derek's flight itinerary. Tokyo to Zurich, 4-hour layover. Vivian didn't reply. She put her phone on the passenger seat, leaned back, and closed her eyes. The evening light slanted through the window, painting her profile in warm orange. Her lashes were long, casting a small shadow on her cheek. Her lips were slightly pursed, whether from tension or release, it was impossible to tell. She sat there until the school bell rang and the flood of children's voices spilled from behind the wall. Only then did she slowly open her eyes. Vivian got out and walked to the school gate, finding her place among the other parents. She spotted Siti running out in her little backpack, 2 pigtails bouncing, her round face flushed and bright, a sunflower smile when she spotted her mother. "Mommy!" Vivian crouched to catch her, lifting her into her arms. Sichi locked her arms around Vivian's neck and whispered against her ear, "Mummy, you came to pick me up today. I'm so happy." "I wasn't too busy today." Vivian carried her toward the car. "What do you want for dinner?" "Hot pot." "Hot pot it is." She buckled Siti into her booster seat, closed the door, and got in the driver's seat. In the rearview mirror, she saw Siti swinging her legs, humming some tuneless song. Vivian started the car. "Mommy," Tc said from the back seat. "Where's Daddy?" Vivian's fingers tightened on the steering wheel for a moment, then relaxed. "Daddy's on a business trip." "Where did he go?" "Somewhere far away." "When is he coming back?" Vivian didn't answer right away. The car rolled through an intersection, traffic lights flashing through the windows in alternating brilliance. She stared ahead and said, her voice very flat, like a line she'd rehearsed. "Do you miss Daddy, sweetie?" A pause in the back seat. Then Siki's voice came again, light and casual. "Not really. He doesn't play with me much anyway. He's always on the phone or looking at his laptop. Last time I drew him a picture, he looked at it and said, 'That's nice,' and then went back to his laptop." Vivian glanced in the mirror. Tici was swinging her legs, no trace of hurt in her expression, just stating a fact. Those round, bright eyes were exactly like Vivian's, so clear that nothing could stay hidden in them. "Then Mommy will spend more time with you," Vivian said. "Good." Cece's voice brightened. The hot pot place was one Tici had chosen, a hidden gem above a commercial street, and she navigated it like a regular. Vivian let her order, watching her tiny daughter direct the waiter like a small businesswoman. "Not too spicy, please." When the pot arrived, Tici suddenly said, "Mommy, smile." Vivian blinked. "I am smiling." "You're not." Titi propped her chin on her hand. "Your eyes aren't smiling. Whenever you talk about Daddy, your eyes don't smile." Vivian met her daughter's clear gaze and felt something thicken in her throat. She took a sip of water, set the cup down, and gave Titi the real thing, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Like this?" "Like this." Titi nodded, satisfied. Steam rose between them, white and hazy. Vivian watched her daughter's small face through it and felt something soft brush against a tender part of her heart. They got home after 9. Vivian bathed Sichi, read her a story, and was about to turn off the light when Sichi tugged at her sleeve. "Mummy, stay with me." Vivian lay down, curling her body around her daughter's small warmth. Tici snuggled close, her breathing quickly evening out into the soft, steady rhythm of deep sleep. Vivian didn't get up right away. She lay there in the dark, listening to that rhythm, her fingers stroking her daughter's hair. Outside, headlights swept across the ceiling, a brief arc of light, then gone. Vivian slipped out of the bed, gently closed the door, and went to the living room. She poured herself a glass of water and stood before the window, looking out at the city's nightscape. Lights spread in every direction, close and far, like scattered gold dust. She pulled out her phone, stared at the unsaved number for a long time. Then she set it down and picked up another phone, an old dual SIM model she kept in the back of a drawer. She turned it on, waited a few seconds. A WeChat message appeared, from someone saved as Z. One short line. "He's gone. A third of the Zurich accounts are frozen, the rest are being traced. You were right. Someone was waiting for him in Switzerland. I'll send the name." Below that, a name and an address. Vivian read it twice, deleted the message, shut the phone down, and returned it to the drawer. She finished her water, turned off the living room lights, and walked back to the bedroom. Passing the hallway, she glanced at the family portrait on the wall. Derek with his arm around her, she holding Sichi, all three of them smiling with practiced symmetry. The photo was 3 years old, from back when Chichi still had a gap in her front teeth. Vivian's gaze lingered for 2 seconds, then moved on. She lay down and closed her eyes. In the dark, the invisible ring of missing tan on her ring finger seemed to press against her skin like a crack that would never fully seal. She slept deeply, dreamlessly. The next morning, Jasmine was waiting outside Vivian's office with a stack of documents and a nervous expression. "Ms. Wen," she said, following Vivian inside, "we've heard from Mr. He." Vivian hung her coat and settled behind her desk. "What did you find?" "He arrived in Zurich last night and checked into a hotel. I looked it up. The hotel is about a 10-minute walk from the registered address of his offshore company." Vivian didn't look up, fingers moving across her keyboard. "Anything else?" "And?" Jasmine's voice dropped lower. "Last night, he used the hotel phone to call a number back home. I traced it, as you asked. The owner is a woman. Last name, Yang." Vivian's fingers stilled briefly, then resumed. "Find out everything about her relationship with Derek. Also, send me the asset list I asked you to prepare last week." "Yes, Ms. Wen." Jasmine turned to leave, then stopped. "Jasmine." Jasmine turned back. "Before Derek left, did he contact anyone else at the company? Yourself, for instance?" Jasmine's expression flickered. Barely perceptible, but Vivian caught it. She waited. Jasmine dropped her gaze. After a long silence, she said, "Mister, he called me the afternoon he left." "What did he say?" He said to take care of you and Cece, that he'd be back in a while, and to tell you not to look for him." Vivian nodded, expression unreadable. "Anything else?" "That's all." "All right, you can go." After Jasmine left, Vivian leaned back and stared at the closed door. The silence Jasmine had left behind still hung in the air like a dropped needle. She didn't press, not yet. She worked through the morning. Around 10, a message came in from old Joe, one line, accompanied by a photo. "Ms. Wen, Mr. He checked out of the hotel this morning and moved to another one. In the photo, he's meeting a man, still identifying him." The photo was blurry, taken from a distance, but Derek was recognizable in a dark coat, talking to a man in a hat outside the hotel entrance. The man's back was to the camera. Vivian zoomed in, saved it, and replied, "Keep following. Be careful." She set the phone aside and looked at the photo again. Derek's face in profile showed a kind of relaxation she hadn't seen in a long time, the ease that only came when someone was far from a place, far from a person. She wondered what he was relaxing from. Was it leaving her, or leaving something he'd been afraid of all along? She wasn't ready to decide. At midday, her mother called. "Vivian, your father had another episode this morning. His chest was tight. Old Joe took him to the hospital. Come over when you can." Vivian set down her chopsticks. "Which hospital?" "Central Hospital, same ward. Don't worry, the doctor says it's just blood pressure fluctuation. 2 days of observation." "I'll be there this afternoon." After hanging up, Vivian sat still for a moment. Outside, the autumn sky was high and clear, a few clouds drifting lazily. She watched them and felt something heavy sink to the bottom of her chest. Her father's health had been deteriorating since the previous year. He'd always had hypertension from years of hard business, but medication had kept it in check. Then, the joint development project led by Derek had run into trouble, and Mr. Wen had suffered a minor stroke. Not enough to disable him, but the vitality had drained out of him after that. Vivian sometimes wondered how much her father knew. Maybe bits, maybe everything. With Mr. Wen's sharpness, he couldn't have been completely blind. But he never said anything. Neither did she. Father and daughter shared a strange, tacit silence as they watched the son-in-law wander further on their territory. At the hospital that afternoon, Mr. Wen was propped up in bed reading a newspaper. He set it down when Vivian walked in and gave her a thin, sick-room smile. "You're here." Vivian sat by the bed, tucked his blanket, glanced at the medicine boxes and fruit on the side table. "Mum said you had another episode." "Old ailment," he waved a hand. "Nothing serious. How's work?" "Fine." A silence settled between them. The room was quiet, sunlight painting a bright square on the floor. Vivian watched that square of light until her father spoke again. "How's Derek these days?" Vivian didn't move her gaze. "He's abroad." Mr. Wen frowned. "Where?" "Zurich." Another silence. Mr. Wen's fingers moved restlessly over the blanket, as if counting something. His face, carved by age and illness, slowly took on an expression Vivian couldn't quite place. Not anger, not surprise, just the weary confirmation of a disappointing prediction. "Vivian," he said, voice lower now, "there are things I never told you." "I know." Mr. Wen looked at her. Vivian met his gaze. In that moment, a great many things passed between them without words. "When did you know?" he asked. 2 years ago." Mr. Wen fell silent for a long while. Then he let out a breath so deep it seemed to release years of weight. I thought I could hold on until you were secure." "I am secure now." Mr. Wen studied his daughter's face. She sat in the afternoon light, calm and composed, the line of her mouth neither soft nor hard. She looked unfamiliar to him, not with distance, but with a different kind of strength. His 35-year-old daughter had become a tree that needed no support. "Whatever you decide," Mr. Wen said, "I won't stop you. But Titi is young. Don't let the adult's business hurt the child." "I know." When Vivian walked out of the hospital, dusk was falling. She stood at the entrance, watching people pass, relatives with thermal food carriers, patients in hospital gowns shuffling in the yard, a child in a wheelchair holding a colourful windmill. She stood for a moment, then walked toward the parking lot. Halfway there, her phone rang. "Ethan." "Ms. Wen, I found something." "Go ahead." "Mr. He has a joint account in Zurich with that Mr. Liu, the man he met. There's a significant sum in it, transferred in installments over the past year. Also," Ethan paused, "the woman, Ms. Yang, she flew to Zurich yesterday. Same flight, different class." Vivian stood in the darkening parking lot, surrounded by rows of silent cars, her shadow stretched long under the streetlights. "Understood," she said. "Ethan, I need one more thing." "Name it." "Compile a complete record of every related party transaction Derek has made through Wen Group. Every transfer of funds, every contract, every counterparty. Send it to me when it's ready." "I can do that. But Vivian, once these materials go out, Mr. Fee, he won't just be looking at civil liability." "I know." She ended the call and got in the car. As she started the engine, she glanced at the clock. 6:17 p.m. Titi was still at her grandmother's. She set her navigation toward the in-laws' house. 2 blocks later, she pulled over to the curb. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel and stayed that way for about 30 seconds. Then she straightened, rebuckled her seatbelt, and stepped on the gas. At her mother-in-law's building, she parked and went upstairs. When He opened the door, her face was tight. She mustered a weak smile when she saw Vivian. "Vivian, come in." Vivian changed into slippers and saw Chi-Chi watching cartoons in the living room, a plate of cut fruit on the coffee table. Chi-Chi hopped up and ran to hug her legs. "Mommy!" "Sweetheart." Vivian stroked her head, then looked up at her mother-in-law. "What's wrong?" "Mrs." He hesitated, then pulled Vivian into the kitchen and closed the door. The old woman's hair was mostly white now, her face deeply lined, and the wrinkles held a kind of anxious dread. "Vivian, has something happened to Derek?" Vivian didn't answer immediately. "He called me the day before yesterday, Mrs. Head," he said in a low voice. "Said he had to go away for a while and to take care of Siti. I asked him where, and he said don't ask. I've been his mother for over 30 years. I've never heard that tone from him." Vivian leaned against the counter and looked at her mother-in-law's tear-bright eyes. "He did leave, Mum. Derek and I are having some issues, and I'm handling it. But whatever happens, I'll make sure Titi is taken care of." "Mrs." His lips trembled. She turned away and wiped her eyes. Vivian said nothing more. She went to gather Siki's things, helped her pack her little backpack, and took her hand. At the door, Mrs. He pressed a bag of fruit into Vivian's hands. "Vivian," the old woman said, her voice shaking, "no matter what happens between you and Derek, you'll always be my daughter." Vivian looked down at the heavy bag of fruit, then up at her mother-in-law. Her smile was brief and faint, but it carried a steadiness that seemed to reassure the older woman. "Thank you, Mom." On the drive home, Tisi fell asleep in the back seat, her small head lolling against the car seat, mouth slightly open, breathing even. Vivian glanced in the rearview mirror, then focused on the road. Streetlights swept past the windows in alternating flashes, carving changing patterns across her face. She pulled into the garage, turned off the engine, and didn't wake Titi right away. She sat in the dark, listening to her daughter's soft breathing, and realized she hadn't sat this quietly in a very long time. She pulled out her phone and opened the photo album, scrolling to the bottom. Their wedding photo. She, in white, Derek in a tuxedo, both smiling without reservation. At the reception, Derek had been slightly drunk, arm around her shoulder, telling everyone, "The luckiest thing in my life is marrying Vivian." She'd believed him then. Now she looked at the photo and felt like she was watching someone else's movie. She put the phone away, gently woke Titi, carried her upstairs, and went through the routine: bath, pajamas, story, lights out. By the time Titi was fully asleep, it was nearly 10. Vivian slipped back to her own bedroom. She didn't turn on the light. She leaned against the door, listening to her own heartbeat in the darkness, steady, heavy. Then she walked to the vanity, opened the drawer, and took out the black velvet box. She opened it and looked at the plain platinum ring. The ghost of it on her finger was invisible in the dark, but she could feel it, like a wound that had healed but left a scar. She closed the box, put it back, and shut the drawer. Then she went to the bathroom to remove her makeup, wash her face, do her skincare, the same routine as every night. Her face in the mirror was pale under the overhead light, no expression beyond the ordinary. She looked for a moment, then hung up the towel and turned off the light. In the darkness, she lay down, turned on her side, and pulled the covers to her chin. A thin slice of moonlight crept through a gap in the curtains, falling at the foot of the bed like a silver blade. She closed her eyes. The next morning, a thick file sat on Vivian's desk when she arrived. She opened it, pages and pages of documents, tables, bank statements, contract copies assembled overnight by Ethan. She brewed a cup of tea and began reading, page by page. The deeper she went, the calmer she became. Not numbness, a deeper certainty, as if she'd been guessing what lay behind a locked door and finally pushed it open. What she saw was more or less what she'd expected. Derek had done many things with Wen Group's resources: grey market deals, legal but questionable maneuvers, and a few entries that made her pause. Those last few, strictly speaking, bordered on embezzlement. She set those pages aside. Then she picked up another file, the list of assets Derek and the other woman held jointly: real estate, vehicles, a beauty salon, and a baby maternity brand. Vivian paused at baby maternity and turned to the next page. A copy of a birth certificate. Mother, Ms. Yang. Father, Derek, he. Date of birth, 18 months ago. Vivian stared at that date for a long time. Then she placed the page back in the file, resealed it, and walked to the window. Outside, the autumn sky was clear and vast. Sunlight blazed off the glass facades of distant office towers. People flowed through the streets below, none of them knowing that on the 38th floor of this building, a woman had just confirmed her husband's second child. Vivian stood by the window, sunlight on half her face. Her expression barely shifted, though the line of her lips tightened for a moment, then relaxed. She returned to her desk and picked up the phone. Ethan, I received the materials. Do you have contacts for psychological support? Someone good with children specifically. Please make an appointment for me. A pause on the other end. I'll arrange it. Thank you. She hung up, reviewed the isolated pages again, and called Jasmine in. Jasmine came in paler than the day before. Vivian slid the pages across the desk. Did you know about these? Jasmine looked down at the papers for a long time, then raised her head with red-rimmed eyes. Ms. Wen, I'm sorry, I knew some of it, but I couldn't tell you. Why couldn't you tell me? Because... Jasmine's voice cracked. Mister, he said, if I said anything, he would fire me. I needed this job. My mother was in the hospital, and I... Vivian cut her off. And now? Jasmine blinked. Your mother's out of the hospital now, Vivian said. You could survive without this job. Tell me the truth, and I'll write you a strong recommendation. Don't tell me. Today is your last day. Tears welled in Jasmine's eyes. She looked at Vivian's expressionless face and finally nodded. Ms. Wen, I tell you everything. Jasmine talked for over an hour. She detailed everything Derek had done in the company over the last 2 years, the documents she'd processed, the accounts she'd helped conceal. Her words came in fragments, broken by sobs, but she kept going. Vivian listened without interrupting, occasionally sipping tea, occasionally jotting notes. By the time Jasmine was done, it was noon. The sun was directly overhead, flooding the office with bright light. Go home and rest, Vivian said. Don't come back this afternoon. Resume tomorrow. Jasmine rose, still crying, but paused at the door and turned to Bo deeply. Ms. Wen, I'm sorry, truly sorry, sorry. Vivian met her tear-streaked face and, after a beat, said, You can go. When the door closed, the office was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioner. Vivian leaned back, staring at the crystal chandelier above, processing everything Jasmine had revealed. She'd thought she knew everything. There were more details than expected, but the main shape of it was unchanged. Derek had just been more careful, more thorough, more relentless. She picked up her phone and dialed the unsaved number. It rang twice. A click. Heavy silence. Vivian spoke first, her voice calm, like talking to an old acquaintance. Derek, I know you're listening. A pause. Then Derek's voice came through, rough, tired. like he hadn't slept or had been drinking. "Vivian." "You don't have to explain," she said. "I'm not asking. I just want to tell you one thing." "A beat." "The documentation I have is enough to put you away for 5 years. If you come back now and hand over what you need to, sign what you need to sign, we can part ways cleanly. If you keep running, I can wait. I don't mind. The case won't be filed immediately. I can let it sit for a year or 2. But it'll be there when I'm ready." A long silence. She could hear Derek's breathing grow heavier. "Vivian," he finally said, his voice raw. "You had this all planned, didn't you? The night you left, I knew you'd gone. Then why didn't you stop me?" Vivian laughed, soft and cold, like a shard of ice on porcelain. "Why would I stop you?" Complete silence on the other end. Vivian pulled the phone away, looked at the unsaved number on the screen, then brought it back to her ear. "I'm giving you 3 days. In 3 days, I want a signed divorce agreement in my office. Asset division, according to my list. If you don't agree, I'll do it my way." She paused. "The woman, the child. I won't touch them, but I want the money you gave them back where it belongs. I don't want Zichi to grow up knowing her father's money came from the wrong place." A muffled crash came through the line, like something thrown against a wall. Derek's voice returned after a moment, frayed at the edges. "Vivian, let me see Titi. Come back, sign, fulfill the agreement, and you can visit her." "Don't." "Derek." Vivian's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "You didn't think of Zichi when you left. Now you do. Isn't it too late?" The line went utterly silent. Vivian hung up and set the phone on the desk. Her fingers lingered on its edge, cool against her skin. She looked out at the autumn sky, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly. The tea on her desk had gone cold. She took a sip. The cold liquid slid down her throat and made her shiver faintly. She set the cup down and started flipping through the file again. 3 days later, an international package arrived from Zurich. Inside was Derek's signed divorce agreement, filled out exactly to her specifications. Asset distribution, property ownership, custody, visitation, everything. The signature was scrawled, the hand of someone writing in deep exhaustion. At the bottom of the package was a note card with one line. "Send me pictures of Siti, more than a few." Vivian stared at that line for a long time. Then she folded the note and tucked it into the bottom of her drawer. She checked the entire agreement, confirmed every detail, and picked up the phone. "Ethan, the agreement is signed. Proceed with the filing. Let me know when the divorce is finalized." A pause. "Vivian, is there anything else you'd like me to handle regarding Mr. He?" Vivian thought for a moment. "Freeze all his domestic assets until I confirm the agreement has been fully executed. Don't touch Ms. Yang's house or the shop. I said I wouldn't, and I won't." "Understood." "Also," she hesitated, then continued, "the shares in the baby maternity brand." She stopped again. Ethan waited. After a moment, Vivian said, "Transfer them into a trust. Beneficiary, Derek's other child. Don't let Ms. Yang manage it. Don't let Derek touch it. Find a reliable third-party trustee." A beat of silence. "Vivian, that's not like you." "I know," she said, "but that child didn't ask for any of this." She ended the call and sat in her office. The sky outside seemed bluer than it had been. She looked down at her ring finger, at the pale band of missing tan. In the afternoon light, it was barely visible. She touched it gently. Then she picked up her phone and sent Siki a voice message. "Sweetheart, I'm leaving work early today. I'll pick you up and we'll go to the amusement park, okay? A moment later, Siki's soft little girl voice came back. Okay, I want to ride the carousel. Vivian listened to her daughter's voice and smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. She shut down her computer, grabbed her coat and bag, and walked out of her office. The autumn evening air was cool against her skin, carrying the sweet smell of roasted chestnuts from a street cart. She walked along the sidewalk toward the parking lot, her heels crunching through fallen leaves. She stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky. The clouds at the horizon were painted in deep shades of orange and purple, with a thin layer of lavender floating beyond. She breathed in deeply and kept walking. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out. Ethan. 4 words. All is proceeding. She looked at it for 2 seconds, then slipped it back in her bag and walked toward her white sedan. The setting sun stretched her shadow long across the pavement, her heels clicking steadily behind her. She got in, started the engine, and merged into the evening traffic. Lights began to bloom across the city, one by one, connecting into a warm constellation of gold and white. Vivian drove with the radio, playing a soft old song, humming along, her fingers tapping the steering wheel in time. In the rear-view mirror, her face was serene, brows relaxed, a faint curve at the corners of her mouth. The phantom ring was still there on her finger, but she'd stopped noticing it. It was still there. It just didn't matter anymore. Vivian picked up Sichi. The amusement park was still open for another 3 hours, but when they pulled over, Sichi said, "Mummy, I don't want to go to the amusement park today." "Why not?" Sichi thought for a moment. "I want to go to the place with all the fish. Daddy took me once, but I didn't get to see everything." Brief Pause. Vivian noticed that when Sichi spoke of her father, it was with the same casual detachment as mentioning a passing cat, familiar but not close. She didn't dwell on it. "The aquarium, right? Mummy will take you." The aquarium was south of the city, about a 40-minute drive. Tichi was quiet in the back seat, watching the streets scroll by, occasionally pointing at a billboard or a cloud that looked like a rabbit. Vivian answered each observation from the rearview mirror, her gaze softening as she watched her daughter's small face. Inside the aquarium, Tichi pressed her nose to the glass, watching fish glide past. When a giant manta ray swept overhead, she froze, then turned to Vivian. "Mummy, it's like a flying carpet." Vivian knelt to her level. "Do you want to travel on a flying carpet someday?" "Yes," Titi nodded emphatically, "and I'll take you with me." Vivian smiled and stroked her hair. They left the aquarium as night fully fell, grabbed a simple dinner at the mall, and on the drive home, Titi finally surrendered to sleep. Vivian turned up the heat slightly, slowed the car, and wove smoothly through familiar streets. When they got home, she carried her sleeping daughter upstairs, tucked her in, and went to the living room. She sank onto the sofa, looking out at the bright city lights. Today had been calm, slow, warm, like a spring after tension finally released. Her phone lit up. "The agreement is filed. If everything goes smoothly, the divorce certificate should be ready by next Friday." She read it twice and replied, "Good." She set the phone down and leaned back. The room was quiet, the city shimmered beyond the glass, her own breathing was steady. She closed her eyes and felt her heartbeat, steady, unhurried, like something that had finally arrived. After a while, she rose and walked to her closet. From the top shelf, she pulled out an old photo album, the one from their wedding year. She opened it to the first page, the two of them under a flower arch, smiling with abandon. Derek's eyes had light in them then. So had hers. She flipped a few pages. Her father, Mr. Wen, walking her down the aisle, back when he'd been healthy, his back straight, his eyes proud, and just a little sad. She closed the album and put it back. She didn't throw it away. She didn't need to delete anything to prove she'd moved on. The next morning, when Vivian arrived at the office, a bouquet of flowers sat on her desk, white roses and lizanthus wrapped in pale green paper. A card beside them held Ethan's handwriting. "A new page begins today." Vivian stood still for a moment. Her expression barely changed, but her fingertips brushed the cool, soft petals. In the morning light, the roses glowed with a subtle sheen. She turned the vase toward the window, toward the sun. Then she sat down and opened her laptop. At 10, she held a department meeting to announce the restructuring. Derek's VP position remained unfilled. She'd absorbed his divisions herself. She'd been planning this for days, and her delivery was clean, measured, irrefutable. No one in the room raised an objection. Afterward, old Joe followed her into her office. "Miss Wen, about Mr. He, when will you tell the family?" Vivian poured 2 glasses of water and pushed one to him. "Gradually. My mother doesn't need to worry yet. She's not well herself. My father knows some but not everything. I'll talk to him when he's discharged." Old Joe nodded. "And Mr. He's assets?" "Freeze what needs freezing, transfer what needs transferring. Mr. Su is handling the legal side. You'll coordinate with him on the operational side." "Understood." Old Joe sipped his water, then said, "Ms. Wen, I have something I've been holding back." Vivian looked at him. "Go ahead." "Mr. He, when you married him, I didn't object because I saw how happy you were. But I could tell over time that his heart wasn't here. He was taking from Wen Group to cover his own holes. I mentioned it to your father once when he was still healthy. He was silent for a long time, but he never moved against Mr. He. Do you know why?" Vivian said nothing, holding her glass. "Because you'd just had Cece," old Joe said. "He didn't want you to fall apart." Vivian's fingers tightened on the glass for a moment, then loosened. She looked at the tea leaf floating in the water and said, "I know." Old Joe rose and patted her shoulder. "You've grown into someone we're all proud of." After he left, Vivian sat alone for a long time. Sunlight poured down from overhead, lighting up the papers on her desk. Her fingers rested against the cool glass of her water, but somewhere inside her, a corner had grown warm. In the afternoon, Ethan came by with the final divorce documents. Vivian signed them and handed the pen back. "Thank you, Ethan." "Part of the job." He tucked the papers into his briefcase, looked at her steadily. "Vivian, can I ask something personal?" "Go ahead." "Do you hate Derek?" Vivian leaned back and thought seriously. "I used to. Now, not hate exactly. Just feels like wasted years." Ethan smiled faintly. "Have you thought about what's next?" "Stabilize the group. Take care of Cece. Beyond that," she shrugged, "I'll see. Me." Ethan zipped his briefcase, stood, and extended his hand. Vivian rose to take it. His grip lingered a little longer this time, his palm warm. The autumn suddenly felt less cold. "I'll be going," he said. "Take care." At the door, Vivian called after him. "Ethan." He turned. "Thank you for not pushing me to explain things back then. I couldn't find the words." Ethan studied her for a moment, then smiled. "When you do find them, I'll listen." He left. Vivian stood by her desk, looking at the closed door, and felt her heartbeat quicken, just slightly. She didn't analyze it. She just turned and changed the water in the white roses. A week later, the divorce certificate came through. When Vivian took the thin paper from Ethan, her hands were steady. She placed it in a brown envelope and locked it in the bottom drawer of her desk, beside the velvet box with the wedding ring. The drawer clicked shut. A final lock finally closed. That night, Vivian came home to find Sichi on the carpet with her Legos. She looked up beaming. "Mummy, I drew a picture today." "Let me see." Sichi dug a crumpled paper from her backpack, 3 figures in crayon, tall, short, and very small. The tall one was Mommy, the shorter one was Sichi, and the very small one was a cat. "What's this?" Vivian pointed at the cat. "It's my teacher's cat. Her name is Marble. I pet her today." Vivian crouched beside her. "It's beautiful." "Mommy," Cece said suddenly, "can we get a cat at home?" Vivian considered. "Yes, but you have to promise to take care of it, feed it, clean up after it, take it to the vet. Can you do all that?" Sichi nodded fiercely. "Yes!" "Then we'll go to the pet store this weekend." Sichi bounced on the sofa with glee. Vivian watched her daughter's unburdened joy and felt warmth spread through her chest. Not dramatic, just a slow comfort, like a hand resting on the coldest part until it too began to thaw. Later that night, after Sichi was asleep, Vivian sat on the windowsill with a cup of warm milk. The moonlight was bright, painting the city's streets and rooftops in silver. She thought of many things. The scarf Derek had brought back from a business trip in their first year. Wrong color, but she wore it all winter. The night Sichi was born. Derek waiting outside the delivery room all night, red-eyed when she came out. His last birthday, a full table of food she'd cooked, and the message that he had to work. The night he'd left, standing in the doorway of the empty closet, the stillness that felt like nothing. She turned each memory over like pages in an album. Some were faded, some curled at the edges. They were all still there. She didn't need to rip them out. They simply sat on the shelf, gathering dust. She finished her milk, rinsed the cup, turned off the lights, and went to bed. A sliver of moonlight fell across the floor. She lay watching it until her eyes closed. She dreamed of a wide river, its water calm, sunlight breaking into 1,000 golden flecks on its surface. Beside her stood a small figure, Sichi in her pink jacket, tossing pebbles into the water. Each stone sent rings rippling outward, then smoothing back to stillness. Vivian crouched beside her daughter and tossed stones too. 1, 2, 3. The golden light danced with each ripple. She woke to a new day. Golden morning light flooded through the curtains. She heard Cece stirring next door and the sound of the little cat, the one she'd adopted the week before, padding around the bedroom. Vivian sat up, stretched, and felt good all through. Her phone glowed with a new message. Ethan. "Lovely weather today. I know a new Cantonese place. Free tonight?" She looked at the message, smiled faintly, and typed back. "Free? What time?" She set the phone down and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains. Golden light flooded the bedroom floor. The city's outline was crisp and clear in the autumn morning. Below, plane leaves were beginning to turn yellow, rustling in the breeze. Siki's voice drifted from next door, sleep-soft. "Mommy, are we eating cat food today?" "Today, we're having dim sum." "What's dim sum?" "Shrimp dumplings, rice rolls, chicken feet." Sichi jumped off the bed, bare feet slapping against the floor, and ran to wrap herself around Vivian's legs. "I want lots of shrimp dumplings." Vivian looked down at her daughter's upturned face, those bright eyes that mirrored her own. Autumn sunlight turned Siki's baby-fine hair to pale gold. She lifted her daughter into her arms. Outside the window, the sky was a deep blue. Clouds drifted lazily. The breeze carried a hint of osmanthus. "All right," she said. "You can have all you want." As she carried Siki into the living room, her gaze passed over the brown envelope on the nightstand. The divorce certificate, the wedding ring, both sealed away inside. She didn't linger. She walked her daughter into the sunlit living room. Her phone buzzed again. Ethan had sent a photo of a restaurant sign. "Good luck," it read in English. A message followed. "This is the place. I'll be there at 6. Vivian typed back a single word. "See you." She pocketed the phone, buckled Siti into her booster seat, and went to pour 2 cups of warm soy milk. Morning light streamed through the kitchen window, spreading gold across the counter. Vivian leaned against the stove, sipping her milk, watching Titi swing her little legs and wait for breakfast. The autumn morning felt brighter than any she could remember.